Right. So rivers, where are we? So rivers offer fantastic connecting corridors when managed well for wildlife. They're a source of blue carbon. They're also an important resource. Just 2% of the planet's water is fresh. And as we've seen, the impacts of climate change become all too real. I think we probably all share a common concern and interest in seeing rivers managed well for nature and using that then to demonstrate the benefits of how healthy, vibrant ecosystems that are rich in nature with good access can have benefits on reducing climate change and the impacts of climate change, principally through um, sustainable water management, you know, um, flood reduction and drought alleviation. So tonight we are focused on the Lugg, which is a very important river to all of us who live in the marches. It is a site of special scientific interest. Once wild, still has a lot of natural hydrological features. Sadly, like far too many of our rivers, is in a declining state. So Natural England, in their most recent reports and their condition assessment on the Lugg, classified the Lugg as both declining, but sadly continuing to decline. So across Herefordshire Wildlife Trust and Radnorshire Wildlife Trust, we have a big focus on rivers and uplands and focusing on addressing the problems that we're seeing. So principally within the Lugg, we're dealing with impacts from agriculture and land use, sewage, but also development. And we're working across the border because nature is border blind. Rivers are lengthy and complicated with many tributaries. And I think we can only fix the problems we face by collaboration. And that must start with ourselves, the wildlife trusts. So it's with great pleasure that I can introduce our first speaker, Dan Westbury, to talk about storing water in the uplands. So over to you, Dan.
Great, thanks, James. And can everybody see my screen there okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, so welcome, Croeso. Thank you for coming this evening. I will try not to waffle too much, so I do have a tendency to do so. But yeah, my name's Dan. I run the Wild and Lug project with Radnorshire Wildlife Trust. We're at the early stages, but we've really hit the ground running, and yeah, we've got some really promising things upcoming. But what I wanted to do with today's presentation was actually talk a little bit around the background of what I'm thinking about in regards to my area of the Lugg, which is from where it rises on Pool Hill all the way through to where it crosses into the Herefordshire side at Prestine. So I see a lot of elevation change, and therefore I also probably have the cleanest part of the river, which is selfishly great for myself. But yeah, I appreciate the issues we have all along the Lugg. So just a little background on myself. I'm trained as an ecologist, but I've got a diverse background from landscaping through to the arts, and I'm very passionate about farming and conservation sitting at the same table. And hopefully that's what makes me the right person for this job. So let's get into it. So just quickly, the contents. I'll go over what natural flood management is, because that is primarily one of the key focuses for the Wild and Lug project. And then I'm going to take a top-down approach for my area, the catchment. We're going to talk about the upland heaths. We're going to talk about soils, and then we're going to move down to the valley bottoms and lower slopes, and then some of the opportunities we have there. So let's get into it. So I like to think of natural flood management as working with natural systems rather than against them. And we do this through a range of different interventions or managements. But generally, we're trying to slow the flow of water out of a catchment, increase roughness and complexity of the landscape within the catchment, meaning that essentially water is entering our rivers and streams more slowly and reducing flood risk then downstream and allowing it to flood where we want it to flood, because it is a very natural part of the river's process, and a huge part of how velocity of the water is reduced is by allowing it to flood onto floodplains. So some examples there, tree planting, bank stabilization,
apologies there. Looks like Dan's frozen. We're both in the same office building, so let's just give him a few seconds to see if that comes back. If not, Dave, can you be on standby to pick up if Dan drops out, and then we'll have to just do a bit of live rejigging, I'm afraid. Apologies to people on that one. Dave, can you take over? Is that okay? Dave Hutton? Right, sorry about that. Looks like Dan has dropped out due to a technical fail there. We'll bring him back and give him a slot after David once he's gathered his thoughts. So it's a great pleasure to hand over to David Hutton, who works for Herefordshire Wildlife Trust and is going to talk to us about recovering floodplain plants on the Lugg Meadows Nature Reserve, which Herefordshire Wildlife Trust manage along with Plant Life and some private landowners. Very famous Lammas Meadow. I'd recommend you visit if you're in the area, especially when the snake's head fertilizers are out. So David, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me and see that screen okay? Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our species recovery project funded by Natural England, very site specific on Lugg Meadows. So where we are, we're right on the eastern edge of Hereford town and right at the other end of the catchment, the Lugg catchment in Hereford. So essentially whatever goes into the Lugg throughout the catchment ends up during these floods going on to the Lugg Meadow, which can present some problems, as you can imagine. So the crikey, the top end of my screen is obscured. So the total area of the, can you see that? That thing is in, that's better. The total area of the Lugg and Hampton Meadows, which is all SSSI and includes Lugg Meadows SSSI, is 155 hectares, and it's about 2.5 kilometres from one end to the other. We own, the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust own about 46 hectares of that. Similar amount, probably a bit more, is owned by Plant Life, the wild plant charity, and there are other private landowners who own large and small chunks within the whole lot. As James said, it's a Lammas Meadow, which means this is an ancient sort of form of common management, which means it's shut up to grow hay from February to August, and the owners have the right to sell the hay which grows. And from the 1st of August, it then becomes a common, and the local people or people who have grazing rights are allowed to graze their livestock on it. It's a really good example of a floodplain meadow habitat, which is in itself is a very rare habitat. And there are only about 1,300 hectares remaining in the UK, and that amounts to a 97% loss of this particular habitat. And the rare habitat, the rare type of plant community we're looking at is called MG4. I'll talk about that more a bit later. It's an important thing to remember about the meadows. It's been created, it's an ancient cultural landscape which has been created really by traditional agriculture. That's what it looks like now and what it's been looking like for most of the winter. And quite a bit of the work that we're doing through the species recovery project has not been done yet because the place has been underwater. That's what it can look like in summer. So there's a lot fewer buttercups now than in that photograph, but it's essentially a wildflower rich grassland. So one of the things that sparked us to apply for the grant from Natural England was some of the problems we're having, and they are the increased nutrient input, which is coming in the form of the nutrients coming down the river, down the Lugg itself, but there are also other issues in terms of atmospheric pollution, which is going on more or less everywhere. There's the increased volume and frequency of flooding. More about that later. And the fact that the floodwaters, this is sort of counterintuitive to probably what other people are going to be talking about, but the floodwaters, if they hang around too long on this particular habitat, they can cause changes and detriment to the diversity of that particular plant community. So that's one of the problems that's going on at the moment, and the increase in nutrients is leading to docks and thistles taking over and a reduction in species diversity. So there are a number of solutions to the issues going on, a couple of which, well, most of which we don't have much control over. The direct control over, that is, the reduction of nutrient inputs coming into the system, which no doubt people will be talking about later on, and to reduce the effects of climate change, which again we don't have much control over, but hopefully on a much larger scale something may be done about it. But what we do have some control over is to try and improve the surface water runoff and basically reinstate some of the ancient systems that were put in place, because the system relies on not only the site being flooded, but actually the floodwaters coming off relatively quickly. The project also supports the enhancement of a few key species, which I'll talk about later. The reintroduction of cattle grazing, because that hasn't been done for quite a few years now. It's only sheep grazing, and it's thought that cattle grazing is an important part of maintaining a diverse structure, and therefore a diverse mixture of plant species. And the other issue which has been going on is the fact that hay cutting has been getting later and later for various reasons. But one of the things we're trying to do is to go back to the traditional hay cutting times of early June, which is what a lot of most of the plants living in the meadows are perennials, so they can cope. They've learned to cope with, or they can cope with that cutting regime. So specifically, the Natural England Species Recovery Programme Capital Grant funds us to recover populations of two rare flood plant meadow plant species, and essentially the whole project is hung on these two species which occur in the citation for the SSSI, and these are both red listed, which means they are of conservation concern. And they are the narrow-leaved water dropwort, and that's the one on the top left-hand side of those photographs, and which is a member of the carrot family. It's a perennial. It grows, is quite resistant to being in quite nutrient-rich ground, which is one of the reasons it's surviving reasonably well in some areas, but not in others. And the other one is the mousetail, which is a member of the buttercup family, which is an annual which likes a certain amount of poaching, and that's all listed on the citation of the SSSI. To be honest, I've yet to find it on the site, but it's one of these plants that comes, it's opportunistic in that it will grow after a little bit of disturbance, and that's one of the things that's driven the project to try and reintroduce cattle grazing. So we are one of the target vegetation, the plant community is called MG4, and that's the National Vegetation Classification, of which the two sort of headline species are the meadow foxtail, the one in the middle, it's a grass, and great bonnet, which is the one at the bottom. And those two are sort of the constants in this particular plant community. So the funding, which amounts to it's nearly £200,000, we're going to be reintroducing cattle grazing. More about that later. Harvesting and propagating seeds and planting actually propagating them to grow plant plugs, which will then be replaced back into the site, the various points where they've they've been reduced or declined. Related to the first one is the installation of infrastructure to enable the cattle grazing, which is about a bridge, and more about that later. And to what we've also done as part of the project is identify where the ancient drainage channels are being blocked, and to identify where those, where they've been blocked, and try and do something about opening out those reinstating basically the ancient form of draining, which hastened the movement of water off the site once the floods have receded. And we've also been working with the floodplain Meadows partnership, who do work on floodplain meadows throughout the country, and so we're trying to particularly understand more about the hydrology of the site, and through that understanding how we can improve the diversity over the whole site. So that's the whole area from top to bottom. It's the Worcester Road at the top end, Ledbury Road in the middle, and that's Hampton Meadow at the bottom. As I say, it's about 2.5 kilometres from one end to the other. That's again another picture of one of the key species of floodplain meadows, the great burnet. A whole host of other wildflower species. A few examples here. This is lady smock, the snake's head fritillary, which there is a really nice patch of snake's head fritillary on the meadows, and interestingly, a lot of them are white in colour. There's one or two of this checkered variety, but a lot of them are pure white. Buttercups, which you saw in the earlier photograph, key component of the community. Goat's beard, black knapweed, one of the alliums, meadow sweet, cat's ear, and various other species, several species of cat's ear and allied. Birds for trefoil, and yellow rattle. So they're all very good nectaring plants. What's happening at the moment is a lot of the diversity of those species is getting a lot less, as well as the grassland species. This is, I forget which one this one is. That one is meadow foxtail, and that's meadow barley. And that's one of the sedges. There's several species of sedge growing in and around the site. And although this is largely focused on plant species, we can't go do a talk without Lugg Meadows without mentioning curlew and the ground nesting birds, two key ground nesting birds growing in the grassland community, curlew and skylark. So to a certain extent, the current management of the site is not favouring the curlew nesting because of the various changes in the management. But there are, the year before last, two curlew managed to successfully fledge from the site, but none last year. There are still a few skylarks nesting on the site. So that's an aerial view of the upper Lugg Meadows, and you can see the network of, this is as the floods have, this is earlier in the year when the floods did actually go down for a while, and you can see the network of foot drains which have been there for centuries, which are designed to hasten the movement of floodwaters off the meadows. Because what happens when the floodwaters sit for any length of time, that's when you get this over enrichment of the meadows, and that's leading to changes in the community, the plant communities. So if you can see, this is a very good example of what's happening on the rest of the site. This winding on the very left of your picture is the Lugg River itself, the River Lugg. On the right, in the centre of your picture, this is essentially an enhanced natural drainage ditch called the Lugg Ree. And once flood water comes up out of the Lugg and then goes down again, all of the remaining flood water has to go flood to the right hand side into the Lugg Ree and then back into the Lugg at the top of your picture. And what happens in many of these areas is the ancient drainage foot drains, like the one where my cursor is, and if you can see that at the very top of your picture, this water here in the middle is not, it can't go any further because these drains are now, they don't go back into the Lugg because there's a blockage in the very end of those drainage ditches, and that's happening on quite a few areas, and this is very typical of what's happening on the site. And there's another area, you can see the very intricate network of drainage ditches, and at the very top left hand of your screen, if you can see it, it just doesn't get into the Lugg Valley. So all of this water that's standing can't go anywhere apart from sit around for a long period of time, evaporate, or go into the soil. And this process is leading to plant community changes and in favour of the bully boys of the plant world, things like dock and thistle, which is leading to reduction in diversity, reduction in the value of the hay, because one of the key management regime, or in order to maintain this plant community, it needs to be taken off as hay. And if it's full of docks and thistles, farmers don't want to buy it. So one of the things we're doing is trying to cut much earlier. More about that later. So another strand of the project is to enhance key species by harvesting seed, propagating them, and then putting them back into areas where they have become, where they've declined, whilst at the same time trying to do something about the existing situation which is causing the decline of those species. So this is some amazing volunteers that we have in Herefordshire, harvesting individual seeds from, and in this case it's the Great Burnet. And they've gone to a place called EcoHab, which is based in a firm called EcoHab, which is based in Gloucestershire. And these are the Oenanthe seeds, doing quite well. We've got about 3,000 of them to put back into the site. And this is one of the other plants which hasn't been mentioned so far, sneezewort. And these are seeds from sneezewort, which are looking quite healthy, and they'll be ready to go back into the site probably next spring. That represents a bridge over the Lugg Valley, because we own a site called Lower House Farm, which in most years, or there are always areas which don't flood, and this is part of the way in which we can help reintroduce cattle grazing. So we can, if we can find a grazier who will have cattle, they know that if the site floods, they have got a refuge to come back out, but they need a cattle bridge to come over the Lugg Valley and onto higher ground. So we need to create a new bridge over the Lugg Valley, which will enable both our management to be much easier, and also for cattle to move to and fro. We'll also be using, again, there's no fencing on this common, so there is a nervousness about people putting their own cattle on the site. So we will be equipping them with satellite tags, which means you can actually dictate by doing amazing things on an app, and a satellite actually controls where the cattle go by giving them a little sound warning through that collar, and then a little electric shock if they go too far. So it helps keep them in the areas that you want them to be. The other issue is hay harvesting, the timing of hay harvesting, which I mentioned earlier. Traditionally, it was cut in mid-June, and if you think about the fact that climate change has probably brought us further forward by about 10 days, this means that, and the whole system is based on taking the hay off when the hay is at its most nutritious. And it is in the past, it was a very important site for hay, very valuable crop, some of the best hay in the county, because of the natural nutrients that were going on to it. And what's happened recently is the cutting becoming later, and that leads to some of the changes that are going on. So what we're trying to do is cut much earlier, from the beginning to the middle of June, and try and get people to cut much earlier. But trying to, obviously, if we know there are curlew nesting, then we'll avoid those areas. And this is the contrast between the previous picture: small scale cutting in lots of different areas at slightly different times. What's happening now is you get about 4 or 5 different contractors cutting the whole site within 1 week. So that the whole cutting regime has changed, and we can try and do something about that by trying to dictate to the farmers when they cut and where they cut, although that's easier said than done. So what's next? We will continue to work with partners and other experts in the management and restoration of the meadows. So we're working with the Lugg Meadow commoners, in particular with the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, helping understand the science of the site and what we can do to improve it. Herefordshire Meadows, experts in the restoration of grasslands. Local farmers, obviously, who are key to the management of the whole site. As I say, possibly arranging the cutting to happen in smaller areas at slightly different times. There's an ongoing challenge, as there is everywhere, with funding for the ongoing management, and so we'd really like to see if we can get some continued funding to maintain the sort of vigilance of what's going on the site. And obviously, very much in key with the rest of this meeting is supporting measures in the catchment to try and reduce what's coming onto the site in terms of pollution, because everything that all of the nutrients, the pollution that's going into the river, as well as the sediments that are coming off agricultural fields in floods like this, in years like this, when the flooded waters stay around for a long time, that all ends up going into the meadows, and it's not helping with the plant diversity. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, David. Very interesting work there, and it is a fascinating site, isn't it? David, have you seen any curlew there this year? Any signs that they might try and breed again?
Earlier on in the season, when the flood went down for a few days, there were about 5 around and they were calling, but since then the waters have come up again. There's nowhere for them to stand at the moment. So plenty of gulls and ducks and but no curlew at the moment.
It's an exceptionally challenging winter, isn't it? I mean, it's going to be, the effects of prolonged anaerobic inundation are going to be profound and long felt, aren't they? I was particularly struck by your fact that climate change has brought forward the hay cutting date by 10 days. Assuming that's at 1.2 degrees of global warming, it's quite frightening to think of what's going to happen if we hit 4 degrees, which is the current projection for the global direction of travel. But keep up the good work, David, and let's move back to Dan, and let's all say, put our hands together and say, come on, Dan, we're rooting for your broadband connection this time. Do not be deterred. If you start on the second slide, actually it's almost like we planned it, because I think it fits very well with following from David, because David is experiencing the effects of prolonged and increased flooding, whereas you're trying to reduce the flood peak and slow the flow starting in the upper reaches. So Dan, back to you. And if just can remind the speakers, if we can try and stick to 10 minutes so we can broadly be done within the hour and have time for questions, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Sorry about that. I think we're really pushing the extent of the Wi-Fi connection here in Llandrindod. But yeah, I'm just going to pick straight back up and hope that it doesn't happen again. So I think I was cut off around about where I was explaining natural flood management. Just really quickly, natural flood management generally can be thought of as working with a river's natural processes to reduce flood risk, but also to increase biodiversity and habitat as well. And the two very often go hand in hand. Some examples of natural flood management might be things like riparian tree planting, floodplain connection, re-meandering the river where it's been straightened or altered previously, and it may mean things like leaky dams and then broader landscape management that some of the other speakers will get into. So let's get into it. So I'm going to take a top-down approach, and we're going to talk about so this, you know, the tops of our hills. This is Beacon Hill, which is where the River Lugg begins, and our upland heath and moor is a man-made landscape through many centuries of management and grazing. But they are really rich landscapes, and they have a lot of merit when it comes to storing water when in good condition. And we can actually think of our upland heath and moor as a permanent water storage rather than a temporary one. So actually, when it comes to reducing peak flows, they're not really where we're looking. What we're doing with these landscapes is making sure they stay wet, and that is exactly what's required, especially with deep peat. If peat dries, it releases a huge amount of carbon, and then it releases water that will enter the catchment that would traditionally stay on the hill. So deep peat and the associated sphagnum moss are around 97% water when in good condition. So it's really important from a top-down approach that we make sure these habitats are in good condition. And there are some aims that we would like to see with these spaces. We would like to see more scrub and a little more diversity and some tree species up there. But generally speaking, first and foremost is to make sure that that deep peat is staying wet, because that really is sort of most crucial. So in regards to capacity for additional water storage, past some small level scrapes and ponds and things, we actually want to look further down the catchment. So let's take a look. So I couldn't not talk about soils. Traditionally, we think of where we store our water as ponds, lakes, rivers, but actually our main water source is our soils, again, when in good condition. So the deeper soils that you find in the valley bottoms, which would traditionally be there because of sediment that has been washed up during flood events, etc., and because of the management we find here. So healthy and organic matter rich soils are going to store water in the top 30 centimeters, which, you know, if you then think of compacted soil or intensively managed soil that isn't allowed a good rest period, has livestock or machinery on it too much, you're really only storing it in the top 10 centimeters. And what you see then, especially with the conditions we've had recently, is the water, it'll infiltrate till 10 centimeters. That happens really fast with current conditions, and then water's going to run off. Because it just has nowhere else to go. So it's going to run off then. And then we have the sort of double whammy there where because of that management, it's also going to take a lot of sediment with it, and generally doesn't have a lot in its way to stop it reaching the rivers. So, you know, I can't stress enough, and I'm sure many of the other speakers will go into this as well, healthy soils really are so key to storing water. And yeah, just quickly, the ways we, you know, ensure that is diversity within the soil structure. So that's diversity of root structure, diversity of plants, trees, etc., and appropriate rest periods for the land as well. So let's move further down the catchment. So in our valley bottoms and our lower slopes, like I said just previously, this is where we are going to find our deeper soils. So up on top of the heath and the moor, apart from deep peat, we're not going to find deep soil there. And so actually the capacity for water storage is relatively low. And so when we look down into the valley slopes here, this is Pentuin Farm, which is Radnorshire Wildlife Trust farm. Looking amazing. Haven't seen it looking like that in quite some time, but yeah, we're all holding out for drier days. But these areas provide space for us to hold back water. So good farming practices in these areas are crucial. Unfortunately, what we see along the upper Lugg is a lot of farming right up against the river, with very little diversity in that riparian zone, which is what we're looking for. And also these areas have been, you know, extensively drained over the centuries to provide good productive farmland. And now it's about finding that balance of retaining good and productive farmland alongside good practices that are going to allow for water storage in our landscapes. And there very much is place for things like wetlands and, you know, wetter meadows within a farming system. And there certainly was traditionally, but like a lot of things within farming and agriculture, it has really, management has really ramped up, as a lot of things across society have. So let's look about some of the interventions we could bring into the fore. So I'll sort of talk about water as it makes its way to the water. The place we really want to intervene is before water reaches the rivers and streams. Once it's in the rivers and it's in the streams, it becomes a lot harder for us to influence. So what we're actually really trying to do is increase the roughness and reduce the direct flow of water into watercourses. One of the best examples, in our valley bottoms, we like to build houses, infrastructure, obviously very important, but alongside infrastructure comes drains, and drains bypass all of this lovely roughness that reduces the chance and the velocity of the water entering the streams. So what we really want to do is we want to increase the complexity of the landscape that the water is passing through before it reaches the watercourse. Probably the best example of this would be a tree. You think about a tree, the water has to filter through hundreds of layers of leaves and branches before it eventually reaches the ground, where it is already vastly reduced in its velocity. It's got more chance to infiltrate into those soils, which are hopefully in good health, as we've discussed, and have ability for water storage. But if we have no trees, no diversity of sward, water has very little in the way of it entering the watercourses. So you can think of our riparian zones, which is the zones along our rivers and streams. You can think of them as kind of the final buffer before that water is in the watercourse and harder for us to control. So a healthy riparian zone, in an ideal world, we'd have 20 meters or more alongside rivers of trees, scrub, diverse grass and meadow species. But in reality, in the upper Lugg, what we see is farming right up against the river, and very little diversity and complexity in the way there. And therefore, once we have the rainfall events that we have been experiencing, that water is just racing into the river, and then it reaches further down the catchment, and you see some of the issues David's experiencing. So we can kind of think of the riparian zone as our last opportunity to slow that water. So as part of the Wilder Lugg project, really working, we want to work hard with farmers to make sure we've got some complexity there in that riparian zone, even if it is, even if the farm system can only allow for a couple of meters alongside the river, that's a damn shout better than nothing at all. So yeah, riparian zones, I can't stress just how important they are. So then when the water does finally enter the river, we can start to think about how we might influence it there. So I've put slow the flow. You might have heard of that. It's a term coined within natural flood management. And you can see on the photo here at the bottom right, an example of a leaky dam. A leaky dam is one way of introducing woody structures into watercourses to help with the peak flows of rainfall. So it's not about reducing the river, the river's base flows or its natural functions, but it is purely there to deal with these increased peak rainfall events we've got. And as water hits those structures, it's going to pass out, and it's going to spread. Essentially, a certain amount of water is going to get held back and then be released slower down to the catchment. So generally these work in unison, and I won't go too much into them, but yeah, things like leaky dams are one method of slowing the flow, but also reconnection with floodplains and things like that, allowing our rivers to spill up onto the land again, where so often we have canalized and stopped that happening to protect productive farmland for longer into the year. And on the left is actually a photo of a river course reconnection done by Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, a really fantastic wetland project they have there. I would encourage everybody to check that out. So just to summarize, top down, our heaths and our moors, our deep peat, we have to make sure it's in good condition. It is a huge permanent water storage, and functioning correctly, it's stopping that permanent water storage entering our watercourses that wouldn't normally be doing so. So we start there. Then we talked about our soils. They are our biggest water store. Can't stress that enough. Healthy soil, knocks onto so many things, not just water storage, but biodiversity in general. And within farming, obviously, and increasingly so, the understanding of healthy soil and healthy produce, healthy crops is, can't be understated. And then in our valley bottoms and our lower slopes, we want to increase diversity and complexity. So all the things I talked about in regards to essentially creating as many things in the way, natural things in the way, before water reaches our rivers. And then finally, when the water does reach our rivers and our watercourses, we start to look at some of the methods of slowing the flow that we discussed, leaky dams, floodplain connection, this sort of thing. Yeah, I think that about covers it. I won't go on too much because I can waffle, but yeah, some space for the questions now at the end. Thank you. Diolch.
Thank you, Dan. That's very interesting and well recovered. I'll resist the temptation to ask you questions, but do urge people to come in at the end. It's a really great project, and I think you've really got stuck in, and we're getting a lot of interest from landowners. And it's a project we'd like to extend into a programme and continue our work with Herefordshire Wildlife Trust and other partners. And I would just urge people, if they haven't been to Beacon Hill, to do so. It just sits above Llangunthlow, which is not far from Knighton. It's a 4,000 acre common owned by the Crown Estate. There's a fairly collaborative bunch of commoners there that we've been working with, which extends our Wye Adapt and our Lugg project to well over 4,000 acres. And that's something we're hoping to have some more news on soon. But it's a wonderfully rich area where you can still hear, in a good year, snipe drumming, see lots of different birds of prey and high levels of things like windchat. So yeah, do check it out. It's a great day out. Right, so moving swiftly on then, I will hand over to Sarenta King, who is Nature Recovery Manager for Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, who's going to talk to us about the excellent work that Herefordshire Wildlife Trust have been doing on creating wetland habitat at Bodenham Lake.
Thanks, James. Can everyone see my slides and hear me? Excellent. So evening, everyone, and thank you to the previous two speakers for their two great talks. I'm going to bring us back into Herefordshire now and talk about one of our nature reserves, Bodenham Lake. So slightly further upstream than Lugg Meadows, which David talked about. Bodenham Lake, as you can see from this map, is located between Hereford and Leinster. It's one of the biggest open bodies of water in the county. And since around 2016, Herefordshire Wildlife Trust have been managing the site. So Bodenham Lake is part of a series of wetland sites in this area of the lower Lugg Valley. So just downstream from Bodenham Lake, we've got Oak Tree Farm, which is a recently created wetland, and another one of our nature reserves just down the hill from Queenswood Country Park. And then slightly further downstream again, we've got Wellington Gravel Pits, which is a working gravel pits, but also a really great site for some wetland wildlife. So it's really significant having these three sites within such close proximity. And we've talked about a lot about connectivity, and these three sites being so close to one another provide a really great stepping stone for wildlife to be able to move through the landscape. And we've also got Lugg Meadows not too much further south from Wellington Gravel Pits as well. So it means that when conditions are slightly more challenging, wildlife has more spaces to move to find the suitable habitat for it. So, moving on too quickly. So this is Bodenham Lake. And since we took on the site in 2016, we've been looking at ways that we can improve the habitats there. So the site used to be a gravel pits, and when it stopped working, it became the lake that it currently is. But when we took it on, it was quite uniform in its habitat. The water depth was very similar across the lake, and there wasn't much variety of habitat. So we've been working to increase that. And that's been through a variety of different methods. So one of the things we did was reprofile the sides of the lake. So you can see around the edges, these yellow areas, there's shallower spaces that we created. You can see with the changing colours in blue, the different depths around the lake. This area on this promontory, we removed a lot of the trees that were previously there, opening up areas that could be used by breeding birds during the spring. And we've created this area to the edge of one of the islands. So the island's still wooded, but there's this bare area just next to it. So it's giving the wildlife that uses the lake more opportunity to breed, to forage, and also hopefully attracting new wildlife to the site. So one of the key focuses for us was to create reed bed on the site, and reed bed is a nationally scarce habitat, but it's really important for a wide range of species. Everything from aquatic invertebrates to different bird species will use reed beds. When we took on the site, that was one of the first things we wanted to do. So this was some reed bed planting that happened back in 2019. The reeds were enclosed using fences to try and prevent too much damage to the young reed plants. And it's been very successful. So this is what the reeds look like currently. So as you can see, they've grown quite significantly. This is some volunteers in there doing some weeding of the reed beds, because the willows that were previously on the lake edges do try and encroach into the reed beds themselves. And as part of our new project, we're aiming to add an additional hectare to the already large area of reeds that exist at Bodenham. And this is because for some species, significantly bitten, a large area of reed bed would be required for them to potentially establish as a breeding bird on the site, which would be a lovely thing to happen. But the larger the amount of reed bed on the site, the better the habitat for some of these species. Reed beds also have a really important use for us in terms of their ability to clean some of the water that's running through the Lugg Valley. So the River Lugg runs right next to Bodenham Lake, and each year the river floods into the lake, and the reeds will help us by taking up some of the nutrients, trapping sediments, and essentially helping to clean some of that water that then eventually flows back into the River Lugg. This year has been significant. The lake has flooded 8 times, which, speaking to our reserve officer who has been managing the site for a long time, he hasn't experienced the lake flooding that frequently ever before, so it has been very significant. And hopefully the reeds are helping to some extent to remove some of the nutrients from that water that's entering the lake. So some of the species that use the reed beds, last year we had a water rail recorded on the site, which was really nice. These photos unfortunately weren't from that recording, but it was still great to have that record. We have great crested grebes. We have 3 or 4 pairs that nest on the lake, and they do nest in amongst the reed beds. We had multiple types of egret recorded, egret and heron. So I think there were up to 4 different species recorded at the lake last year. We have reed bunting, and we also have the otters, and there are a family of otter seen around that area quite frequently. So lots of different species need those reed beds, which is why it's really great that we're establishing them. Within the wider area of the lake, so it's not just the habitat in the lake itself that we're looking to improve, it is the area surrounding the lake. And one of the things we're doing is restoring the meadows. So the meadow that runs between the lake and the river, it has been fairly low in diversity in the past, and we're hoping to improve that diversity. Similar species to what David was talking about at Lugg Meadow, but the area doesn't have the rich history of the Lugg Meadows. So we're improving the diversity a bit more radically than at Lugg Meadow. So last summer we harrowed some of the area and spread new seed within one of the meadows, and we'll be doing the same thing in one of the other meadows this year. We're also going to be getting volunteers out to plant some plug plants, which will just give a bit of a boost to some of the species that might otherwise struggle to become established. That's because the area is currently quite rich in nutrients, and some of the flowers do require a lower nutrient soil, so they might be outcompeted by some of the more rampant species that are on the site. So giving them a bit of a boost by planting plug plants will give them a head start, and hopefully the volunteers will have a good day or two out planting those plug plants for us this coming summer. With that, we are having to review some of the ways that we manage those areas to try and keep that level of diversity. And certainly one of the challenges for us will be if the lake continues to flood frequently during the winter. David mentioned the increased levels of nutrients on the floodplain when it's inundated with flood water. And in the past, we haven't had too frequent flooding on this site, but the more frequent it is, the more nutrients that we will be getting onto these meadow areas. So we will have to look at how they're managed to keep that nutrient load nice and low for the meadow species. So some of the species that we might be hoping to encourage into the meadow grasslands, we've got pyramidal orchids, potentially some bee orchids, but also lots of invertebrate species like this common darter or the orange tip butterfly. So it's not just the plant species that we want to boost on the site, it is also some of these invertebrate species. And speaking of other species, Bodenham Lake is the site of our toad patrol. I think we've got some of our toad patrol volunteers in the audience tonight. So the toad patrol's just come to an end a month or so ago for this year. Bodenham Lake has one of the biggest populations in the county, and the toads do breed in amongst the one of the wet woodland areas down by the lake. And they migrate from the woodlands above the lake. So it is a really important site for that species as well, and to sustain that population. And in the project that we've got ongoing at the moment, we're going to be looking at building some hibernacular for the toads around the lake edges in the hope it might dissuade some of them from crossing the road again in the future. And I just had a few final pictures of some of the species that use the lake. So I mentioned before that we cleared some of the islands of trees to encourage some of the waders to nest on the lake. And we've successfully had oyster catchers nesting there for a number of years now. I believe we had 2 pairs nesting last year. Hopefully they might be able to nest again this year, although with the high water levels, the cleared islands are currently still underwater. So we're hoping they'll hang around until those water levels drop. We have a wide variety of different ducks, including teal, tufted ducks, goldeneye, and a variety of different wade. And last year we had a couple of extra visitors, which everyone was very happy about, although I have said a few times the osprey can just stay away for a couple of years until this project's finished, because they might just get in the way of some of our delivery. But that was a whistle-stop tour of what we've been up to at Bodenham Lake, and hopefully we'll see some of you visiting the site. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great and a really interesting and sort of insightful talk into what has been, years of very positive action on that site. I've never thought of ospreys as getting in the way of work, but I do know what you mean from a practical point of view. Generate a lot of interest,
Yes.
wouldn't it? And that's a small car park at Bodenham Hill, but Bodenham Lake. Just a quick question, because we're thinking about, conducting a reserve. Well, we're not thinking about. We are just starting to conduct a reserve audit to sort of reevaluate the sites that we hold in our own management. Have you started to think about climate adaptation and resilience for Bodenham Lake and how that might have to influence some of your future management or some adaptations of the existing features?
Yeah, so actually just in the last week or so, we've been having a talk about that. As I mentioned, this is the first year when we've seen the lake inundated quite so frequently. So yeah, we've been discussing what could be the impacts of those lakes remaining underwater for too long for the birds to nest on them, and what we could do to ensure there is still space, even if the levels remain higher. So that's something we're going to have to look at in the near future, and it will depend very much on what the weather patterns are doing. But I think it's something that we're going to have to be considering across the whole of our estates, really, is how we future-proof them if the extreme weather we've experienced this year continues.
I think it puts all the more emphasis on collaborating very closely, doesn't it? Because some of the natural flood management measures that Dan is currently seeking permission for and getting interest from landowners on, we've talked about monitoring and putting in flow rate meters above and below. So we should be able to work out the volume of water we're holding back and what that does for the peak surge. And hopefully, if we can do enough habitat interventions and get enough support, we could help Bodenham Lake, which would be well, it'd be a pretty cool feeling, really, wouldn't it?
It would be a very good feeling to be able to feed that impact right the way down the length of the Lugg. So yeah, that would be fantastic.
Okay, thank you. That's really good. So I've seen a couple of questions popping up in the chat, but I think we'll come back to some of those at the end because it's time to move on to Sarenta King, who is currently employed by Radnorshire Wildlife Trust, but part of a project that covers a large section of the Wye catchment and involves Radnorshire, Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, and the Wye Valley National Landscape. So Sarenta, over to you.
Yes, thank you, James. So we are the Wye Adapt Climate Change Project Officers. So it's a wonderful collaboration between Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, the Wye Valley National Landscapes, and Radnorshire Wildlife Trust. So we luckily got this funding from the Community Climate Action Fund, and hopefully we continue this project for 3 years. So we've got some big goals and big ideas to hopefully mitigate climate change in the Wye Valley natural landscape. So here we have my colleagues' working locations. So this is in Herefordshire, the Wye Valley National Landscapes, and this is the project area which I'm covering in Radnorshire. So why are we doing this project? So we currently work with the River Wye, it's our priority. So it's a designated SSSI, and it's currently in an unfavourable condition, very similar to the Lugg, as the Lugg is one of the tributaries to the Wye. There are many issues that impact the Wye. So it's been touched on already, but I'll just go back over it. So pollution, land management, invasive species, siltation, urbanisation, the list is endless. But the overarching is the climate change. So here we have a couple of images of the siltation in the Wye. So that is from the soil erosion from this bank here, which has obviously been grazed right up into the bank. And this is another example of how bad it can flood in the lowlands in Herefordshire. So our main goal is to create a climate resilient landscape and improve it for not only the local communities, but landowners as well, who are suffering greatly from the effects of climate change. Hopefully we can work with both of the communities in this area and to try and work together to hopefully mitigate flooding, droughts, and also the increase of pests. So there is a big problem at the moment with ticks, and that can be from the warming climate. They haven't had a chance to die off in the winter periods, and that can be a big problem for landowners. And this can definitely impact the way in which they manage the land. Part of our project is to support landowners in how they manage their land and to be able to support them through this changing climate and see how we can help mitigate the climate change in these areas. So part of our project is to connect the wider landscape. So this is just an example of one of the materials that we use to help landowners assess what kind of impacts and changes they can make on their land. So this is the soil of the Lugg Valley up in the upper reaches of the Lugg. So this blue line indicates potential opportunities that we could create floodplain meadows and restoration. And we like to use these materials to be able to support landowners in trying to see what opportunities they can implement and see how we can help them in the long run create a more sustainable way of managing their land. Because here is an example of what a resilient landscape should look like. So as we see, there is quite a diverse mosaic of landscapes and habitats throughout it. So the more we can create a wider mosaic, the more species we can introduce. So we can help bring back the curlew, which are very site I'm so sorry, I'm suffering from big cold at the moment. They prefer to come back to the site in which they were raised and hatched, and obviously with the changing climate, lots of their habitats are currently being destroyed. So hopefully, especially in the uplands, we can try and bring these back. So some of the things that we like to do, and Dan's touched on this already, are leaky dams, but also attenuation ponds. So these can help capture runoff from steep slopes, and hopefully in the upland areas, we can encourage landowners to implement these to capture silt runoff, and obviously in heavy rainfall periods. And in heavy rainfall periods, we can also help to slow the flow and retain the water in the uplands where there's well, the water quality at the moment, touch wood, is a lot better than downstream, because in Radnorshire especially, we've a lot of the sources of lots of the rivers in these areas. So at the moment is currently 10 days more worth of rainfall on average in the last 10 years. And so that's increased by 77 millimetres of rainfall on average. So obviously, as we've seen this year, the extreme flooding events can be a lot worse. But hopefully through the implementation of nature-based solutions, we can hopefully try to mitigate the effects of these. So how are we going to do this? So as I mentioned, leaky dams and attenuation ponds, and they can be attached to watercourses and channels, and hopefully reduce the river levels further downstream and mitigate the flashing events that we've had recently. One of the nature-based solutions, which we can implement quite easily in Radnorshire, especially across slope hedgerows and shelter belts and cover crops. So ensuring that soil is not left bare over winter and help put nitrogen back into the soil. This can also reduce the amount of fertilizers which are put on the fields and reduce the fertilizer runoff into the river, which can be one of the stresses on the river itself. So hopefully through the implementation of these trees and the shelter belt, they can obviously retain soil and slow the flow and increase the irrigation of the soil itself. So as Dan mentioned before, we can hopefully allow the water infiltration to increase in this area, allowing it to go below 10 centimetres to reduce the runoff and the speed in which it does hit the river itself. And the more water we store in these landscapes, hopefully we can also mitigate the effects of droughts as well, the two extreme events, and increase the length of time that there are wildflowers and grasses for livestock to graze. So another one of the big interventions we recommend is agroforestry. So obviously increasing how we manage our landscape. So these can be on small scale or large scale, and we can hopefully try to increase the amount of how people manage their land. So through increasing to arable, moving over to cattle, and hopefully through these different sort of interventions and the big possibilities and diversity in which we can implement agroforestry throughout the landscape, hopefully we can increase diversity and these habitat corridors, which are vital for a lot of our migratory species. It also benefits with carbon sequestration. So landowners can not only benefit wildlife, but they can also benefit themselves from gaining financial support from selling off, say, their carbon credits, and hopefully encouraging them to diversify how they use their land and storing the carbon in the soil to hopefully try to mitigate climate change in the long run. But one thing that's amazing about our project is that we've already gone above and beyond some of our goals that we set out to achieve. So we've gone above and beyond the amount of land advice we've offered in hectarage, and we've already got farmers and landowners implementing some of these amazing ideas. So we've got them planting trees, creating shelter belts, their ideas for leaky woody debris suites, and hopefully shifting their land management practices to benefit nature and also benefit themselves facing climate change.
Good. That's excellent. Thank you, Sarenta. So yeah, I mean, it is early days, isn't it, still of your project? And I think you started a little bit later than the sort of English counterparts, but we have been having some early conversations with a 12,000 acre estate, haven't we, who own an awful lot of upland habitat, which is potentially very exciting. And I think, you mentioned agroforestry there. That's something that's very poorly catered for and covered in the emerging sustainable farming scheme that Welsh government are still working on, 6 years on, or whatever it is, since leaving the European Union. But we are supporting people to have conversations with people like Soil Association, aren't we? And think about supply chain contracts and facilitate woodland creation grants. So one of the aims of this joint work is to find champions and ambassadors and case studies for positive action, because the media has become, wow, as the media often is, very dichotomous, and there's a lot of negativity and unease in parts of the farming community in Wales. But there is, when you start talking to people on the ground, a lot of nuance, a lot of desire to change, and a lot of desire to do the right thing by all of the multiple functions and objectives we put on to the land. So thank you, Sarenta. Great project. I hope you feel better soon as well. So I'm going to hand over to Toby Fountain now, who's going to talk about Herefordshire Wildlife Trust's Recovering Our Rivers work, which is in the upper catchment on the Lugg, which is contiguous and adjacent to the work that Dan is doing in the upper reaches. So the upper catchment there in Herefordshire is more pastoral, so livestock based, than you might have seen in some of the photos that Dave and Sarah have shown. So Toby, over to you.
Hi there, can you see my screen and hear me, everyone? Cool. Hi there, my name's Toby Fountain. I'm a nature recovery officer at Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, and I'm here to talk to you about a big project, well, a short-lived but important project for the Trust called the Restoring Our Rivers project. Two caveats. I feel bad presenting this because this entire project was planned and initially implemented by my colleague Holly Thompson, but she had to move on to another project. So I finished the project, but I get to take all the credit for it. So I'm just making that caveat. And also, I'm not a, I consider myself a self-taught ecologist. Like, my big thing is birds and insects and botany. So I'm not a massive river expert, but I am going to pretend that I am one for the next 5 or 10 minutes. So this project was in partnership with the Environment Agency, who are our primary funder, and we focused on a very small localized area of the Lugg catchment in northwest Herefordshire, focusing on 2 brooks called the Lyme and Lingen brooks. And this particular area of Herefordshire, I don't know very well, but it's a really, really nice rural, untouched area. It's kind of near there's a really beautiful village called Wigmore and a really amazing woodland up there called Wigmore Rolls, which I know, and it's a really interesting and quite biodiverse part of the county. So this was a landowner engagement project to a large degree, where we were funding landowners to implement natural flood management solutions in an attempt to improve these watercourses. But there was also a volunteer dimension to it, in that we have also been monitoring the changing state of these small watercourses as we've implemented natural flood management solutions. And because we've only just implemented most of them in the last couple of months, that monitoring process will be going on for another year or so. And actually, I think there's a couple of people in the audience who are part of that monitoring process. So I think that we've all gathered that we're going to repeat ourselves to some extent, but I'm just going to repeat it again anyway. Natural flood management is the use of natural processes to reduce the risk of flooding. But these solutions often have the happy side effect of also improving water quality and also improving biodiversity. And it's said that NFM is based around 3 main principles. So the first is slowing the flow, which we've spoken about already, stopping the water at the top of the catchment from rushing down too quickly and overwhelming the lower reaches. But it also increases the overall volume of the watercourse, which is very beneficial for flooding. Storing water by maintaining capacity. We spoke about wetlands earlier, which is a big thing that I'm interested in. one thing that I find really interesting is that if you look at old maps, the number of little villages that are called something marsh. So I grew up in a village called Cowton Marsh, which according to my neighbour used to be a massive area of rush pasture full of lapwing and curlew. Now it's arable. And people wonder why the brook floods almost immediately in heavy rain. It's because I think that we've really lost the cultural memory of how common wetlands used to be in the landscape, and they probably were a very, very important part of a natural flood mitigation system. And increasing infiltration is the third and final point. And for anyone that knows anything about soil structure, if you have healthy soil, you have a healthy pile of aggregates of particles, and that allows water to flow down slowly and into the groundwater. But if you've got a lot of compaction, then the water runs straight off and straight into the watercourse. So that's really problematic, and that's why positive soil management is really important. So what NFM measures did we implement? We worked with 6 different landowners in the Lingen catchment, and we went mad for leaky dams, because why not? Because leaky dams are the most fun and exciting NFM measure. We installed over 10 leaky dams, and I think of them as being like a artificial beaver dam, and as well as slowing the flow, which has the benefits that we've already described. The creation of this backed up area of slow moving water, which is almost like a pond, one of the positive byproducts of that is that the water starts to deposit some of the pollutants and silts that it's accumulated. So the slowing of the flow has that benefit as well. The other benefit, of course, is that it creates habitat as well. You get this nice kind of wetland area behind the dam, which can be really beneficial to wildlife, particularly wetland flora, but also things like spawning amphibians. Other NFM measures, we've already had some discussion about cross-slope hedging, which seems odd instinctively to think that some hedging hundreds of meters away from a watercourse could be an NFM measure. But the thing that I've learned in this process of learning about rivers is that once you're in a catchment, the whole landscape is like a sieve flowing into that river. And it's all about making interruptions in that sieve. And when you have a strong incline going down towards a watercourse, a horizontal interruption in the form of the roots of a hedge, which intercept the groundwater, is really, really important. We've also funded fencing off watercourses, which obviously prevents damage to the riverbanks and erosion, but also enables the natural regeneration of riparian habitats like riparian woodland, which has really positive benefits for river health as well. So here you can see a map of our project area, and the green dots are all the NFM solutions that we implemented. So it's quite a concentrated area of leaky dams and other NFM solutions. So it'll be interesting in our monitoring process to see whether this has actually made a difference. And the monitoring has been a really fun aspect of the project. We've basically set up 3 monitoring points directly next to places where we've implemented NFM measures in the hope that we can see what the long-term effects of those measures will be. We've trained, I think it's 10 volunteers to carry out a specialized survey form, which includes looking at riparian habitat, river morphology, as well as water chemistry, and also looking at freshwater invertebrates, which has been really, really fun. We started doing the survey before we installed the NFM solutions so that we had a baseline. And now that they have been implemented, we will continue monitoring for a year to see what the effects of the NFMs has been. And I thought I'd show you, because the volunteers have really, really enjoyed having a biological aspect of river monitoring, in that the ecologists who created the form have basically created this scoring system where we go in the watercourse and we do kick sampling, trying to get as many specimens as possible of things like mayflies, of beetle larvae and other insect larvae that are living in the river. But these insects are actually really important indicators of river health, because some are much more pollution intolerant than others. So if you look at the scoring system, stonefly has a very, very high score because it's very, very pollution intolerant. So if you've got a good healthy population of stoneflies in your watercourse, that's a really good indication that you've got a healthy watercourse. And, you know, other things less so. We were hoping to find white claw crayfish in this watercourse, but we didn't. There are signals, but they do stop after a dam, but we sadly didn't find any white claws. And there's two pictures here. Top right, we've got a bullhead, which is a quite common kind of, I guess you'd describe bottom feeding fish that you see in a lot of rivers, and a lovely, lovely mayfly larvae. I think that one of the things that's been really interesting about mayflies, there's so many different kinds, and when you get to look at them under a lens, it's so fascinating watching them, you know, wiggle their gills, flushing oxygen onto their gills, and it's really interesting. I never realized how much life there is in these seemingly quite sterile looking, stony, fast flowing upper reaches of rivers. So finally, looking back on the achievements of the project, we successfully engaged with landowners in the project area, and I think that we got a positive response from them, which hopefully will develop some long-term relationships which are positive to the trust. We successfully implemented a pretty significant amount of NFM in a small area, and it'll be interesting to see if that does make a difference. We successfully trained volunteers to carry out surveying, and I think it's really good getting volunteers involved, because they've, you know, river recovery feels like a very complicated issue, and one feels helpless looking at it a lot of the time. So it's really good that people feel like they can make a difference by volunteering on this project. And also, this is one of the first river dominant and certainly NFM orientated projects that the trust has done. So we've learned a lot that will hopefully be useful experience on any river orientated projects that we do in the future. And that's it from me. Someone told me that it was only meant to be 5 minutes long, so my presentation was quite short. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. That's really good, and you know, sort of segues really well into our project, which we've not long started in the upper reaches, which Dan informed about. Obviously, we've tried to replicate and be consistent with the actions you've undertaken, and we have been in talks across the organisations already about how we continue funding to develop this into a long-term programme. So I think it's, you know, leaky dams have been the star of the show tonight, haven't they? There's a lot of photos of a lot of wood in slightly different contexts, but I think it's probably worth just clarifying for people that perhaps aren't fully in the detail of this, that the UK can't afford poured concrete solutions, even if it wanted them, and we definitely don't want that as wildlife trusts. But it's a sort of a sad truth that while leaky dams are quite well established, the sort of metrics for measuring impact and the return on investment models are actually poorly understood. There's been very little sort of whole-scale academic studies, and there's very little understanding within things like Ofwat frameworks from them, which inform water companies and how they spend, to how this might be a useful and cost-effective technique. So part of our collaborative work and part of our medium to long-term aim will be to change that and to greatly facilitate water companies and public bodies to invest in these measures. So thank you. And, you know, last but by no means least, and perhaps with a slightly different flavour, I'm going to hand over to Chloe Jackson, who is the Wilder Pentuin Project Officer, to talk about the extensive grazing and rewilding work we have been doing there. So Chloe, over to you.
Hiya, can everyone see my screen and hear me okay? Yeah. Bro, yeah, so as James mentioned, I'm going to talk about our site Pentuin. So it's going to be a talk specifically about that, but also how that can have an impact on the wider landscape. So I will touch on water a little bit, but I'll be talking about a wide range of nature's recovery kind of methods that we are undertaking at Pentuin Farm. So we purchased Pentuin in October 2021 for a loan, which we took out of 1.5 million, which we have actually successfully raised the money and paid that back since then, earlier this year. So that was really great. And so we purchased the land then, but we have just started my project in September last year. And the purchase of Pentuin was kind of a strategic purchase, thinking about wider connectivity with the landscape. So you can see here on the map in red is where we've got Pentuin Farm, which is 164 acres. But you can actually then see we've got Canuck Bank, another RWT owned nature reserve, just adjoining it behind, or almost adjoining. So that's 200 acres. And then that is part of the wider Beacon Hill, which is 4,000 acre common just behind. And we've got obviously the source of the Lugg is just north on Pool Hill, north of Pentuin. So in terms of the wider landscape and thinking about holding back water and thinking about kind of connectivity, this was a really good purchase for us. So you can also see here, if anyone knows of any of Radnorshire Wildlife Trust's other reserves, it just gives you a bit more context of where the others are. So really starting to think about how we can look at nature's recovery across a wide landscape. So, you know, this was a good purchase for us as well because of all the changes in farming at the moment with payments. We thought it was a really good time to purchase a farm and try and showcase what can be done for nature and farming at the same time. And, you know, 90% of land in Wales is farmland, and it's 80% of land in the UK. So we can't just protect isolated patches of, you know, nature reserves anymore. We need to think about habitat connectivity across a large landscape. So yeah, the site is split across two sides. We've got the north, which is the larger side, and the south, and it's quite a traditional, previously sheep farmed with a bit of cattle. And we've basically spent the first part of the sort of time since purchasing it and before the project started doing lots of baseline study and trying to figure out exactly what wildlife is already there, what the carbon is like, what the soil is like. So, you know, we've sort of found from soil tests that it's kind of what we expected. It's not a really bad level to start at because it's not had too much artificial inputs. So that's a great starting point for us, and it can only get better with management. And then, yeah, the baseline surveys have also given us an idea of things like birds and butterflies, so we can move forward and get an idea of how the landscape at Pentuin changes. So basically our kind of aim at Pentuin is to make space for nature and to reinstate natural processes to create a more kind of dynamic and shifting landscape. And a big part of this is actually done through the grazing. So we've touched a little bit on grazing tonight, and I saw James has answered a couple of questions as well in the chat. So we have got a mix of livestock at Pentuin. It's very low level, and our livestock graze extensively across the whole site. So they're kind of mimicking natural behaviours of their kind of wild ancestors. So that is really, really important to create a kind of dynamic and shifting landscape where we can kind of see succession of vegetation rather than a static kind of species poor landscape. So we've got our lovely belted Galloway cattle, we've got Tamworth pigs, and we've got Welsh mountain ponies. And yeah, like I said, it is very low levels. We've only got 10 cattle, 2 pigs and 4 ponies at the moment. And we'll be monitoring whether that's the right kind of stocking density through kind of grazing kind of surveys and monitoring vegetation changes. But it's surprising how much just 2 pigs turn over of fair ground. So at the moment, we're keeping an eye on that and making sure it's the right level. But really what we're trying to see is the co-grazing benefits of all of these livestock together. So how they socially interact and how they graze in different ways. So James mentioned on the chat about how cows sort of use their tongue and they wrap around vegetation and tug it. They're also very good for sort of poaching and trampling, getting through woody vegetation and creating kind of bare sort of areas. We've got the pigs literally just, they'll rootle and they'll go for roots and go through the soil and flip over turf. So they'll create these bare ground patches, and that's actually really good for seed germination. So we need that bare ground and we need them to aerate that. And then we've also got the Welsh mountain ponies, which do clip the grass quite short, a bit like sheep, but they're quite selective graziers. So we see them graze certain patches. So between the 3 different livestock that we've got, we get a variety of grazing patterns, which creates much more habitat diversity and should create kind of a mosaic then. So those are a huge part of what we're trying to do at Pentuin, thinking about how we kind of naturally put those processes in place, but we do have to still put in some targeted habitat restoration work as well. So some of that has been, a lot of it's been with volunteers, but we'll also be doing things with contractors. So this is a volunteer actually out the other day doing some sabre tree planting just by the River Lugg, actually just off of Pentuin, our boundary, just across to where kind of it's Cunnock Bank on one side and it's Crown Estate land on the other. So we've been forming some great relationships with the Beacon Hill commoners, the active graziers that are involved on the common and have rights there. We got their agreement to go ahead with this tree planting. So we've just started with planting 200 trees, and you can see here in the picture that we've planted at an angle. So this is called sabre or no fence tree planting. So it's a technique that means that we don't have to put up fences and the graziers can still graze like they obviously need to do on the common. But we basically plant at an angle on the sort of steep slopes and avoid the sheep grazing the leading shoot of the tree. So they might be above on the slope or below, but they won't graze the leading shoot. And we also planted trees like this, but in areas of gorse as well to provide protection from the sheep grazing as well. So another big management kind of technique that we've started is on our 2 forestry areas. We've got 2 plantations on site, 2 mainly larch plantations with a bit of Sitka spruce, so 2 non-native species. And we have been going for continuous cover forestry approach. So we've been slowly thinning the plantation. So we've just done the first thinning intervention on the south plantation. So we've selectively thinned, so we remove every 6th row in the plantation and then thin the 2 adjacent rows next to that, and then leave a row intact for wind stability. So this is so that we try and slowly thin and leave shelter still for birds and other animals, but also preventing kind of wind damage to any of our native trees that are in there. So it's a slow and gradual approach, but it should create a much more sort of varied structure forest as we start doing some replanting. So here you can actually see we don't actually have a replanting kind of stock requirement as we're thinning rather than clear felling, but we thought we'd experiment and start doing a bit of replanting, a bit of enrichment planting of native broadleaf species in amongst the brash to provide some protection from the cattle, and in those kind of thinned rows so that there is light available. So again, this is out with volunteers, which was great. They've been working really hard, walking up and down the hills doing planting. And I've also had volunteers and youth groups out planting hedges. So as I mentioned, a lot of these are sort of just interventions that we've been taking that might not seem linked to the Lugg, but actually, as we've heard from the previous talks, these are still going to really play an have a knock-on effect on the river by holding more water and also by sort of taking up nutrients as well, and stopping kind of the flow of sort of any nutrients into the rivers that we don't want. So this is the youth group out planting. Volunteers also did another two hedges. And this is a technique people might not have heard of. So this is mechanical hedge laying or wildlife hedge laying. So not to say this should replace traditional hedge laying, which is obviously an art and should definitely be carried on. But for farmers, obviously hedge laying can be quite time consuming and quite costly as a result. So this is actually another method that can be used, which we would like to start promoting because it's an alternative instead of people flailing their hedges right down, which is obviously not great for wildlife at all. What you can do is basically pleach, which is where, I don't know if people know much about hedge laying, but you put a sort of notch in the tree, just like traditional hedge laying, but you do it with a chainsaw. And then we use these diggers to help gently put the trees to the ground so that you don't snap the pleach, the tree stays living then, and it doesn't uproot the tree either. So it looks a little bit like a hurricane's gone through, but basically it creates instant kind of stock. It's instantly stock proof. It's also instant shelter for birds. So you can often see birds starting to flock straight away when you use this method, and it will actually create a really thick based and nice tall hedge. So we will hopefully see the results and be able to come back and tell you how successful this has been in a year or so. But yeah, we have just sort of taken this management method recently. But yeah, we think this is a great thing to promote to farmers because of how cost effective and time effective it is, but how it can still benefit wildlife as well. There's some great papers about wildlife or mechanical hedge laying online if people would like to look into it more. So some other things we've been trialing are we'd like to do lots of hay spreading in the summer, so that would be green hay spreading. But in the meantime, we've got some meadow seed and we've had some dry yellow rattle hay, and we are experimenting by starting to actually spread that on some of the bare patches of ground created by the pigs. So you can see one there on the right. So as I mentioned earlier, they do just sort of flip over the turf and create these patches, and they are exposing the soil, which is exactly what we need for seeds to germinate. So if anyone's ever created a wildflower meadow before, the first thing you do is take off the turf to expose the ground and also to remove some of the nutrients. Grass is very sort of dominant, and we need to sort of strip some of those nutrients back if you want a wider variety of species to come through. And that is why we also use yellow rattle when we are creating meadows. So we will be spreading yellow rattle because it's parasitic to grass, and it will again help meadows to establish by letting a lot of other species come through. So yeah, that's something coming up in the summer. We'll be doing lots of green hay spreading, collecting the green hay from local farms which have got botanically rich meadows and don't use artificial fertilizers, and then paying them for their green hay and sourcing it locally, so supporting them, which is obviously a great part of the project if we can do that. Here was a little bit of a task that wasn't initially planned, but just something that the volunteers did still enjoy. So keeping an eye on sort of wet areas. This tree was showing some signs of stress, and probably has been for quite a few years. Very wet around its sort of roots, and poaching as a result, around too much poaching around it can be damaging to the tree. So we've got the volunteers out just using some hazel that we coppiced to make a big kind of tree guard around it. But we will be looking at sort of more novel ways to do this using no fence collar technology. So our cows are equipped with no fence collars, and we can set digital boundaries with those collars. It's a really useful bit of kit that we're hoping more farmers will start using. It can be very useful up on Beacon Hill to put cattle up on the hill, which at the moment there's not many up there on the common. But it means that farmers can very easily, just check an app and see where their cows are. They can set the boundaries which can help with TB, because you can sort of heft cows to and know that they've been away from other cattle and prove that, even if there aren't any actual fencing there. And it can even tell you if your cow's been still for too long and things like that. So, it's very, very useful. So we will be starting to use that technology more cleverly to exclude cows from areas or move them into certain fields very easily, so that we can graze a field, for example, and prepare it ready for meadow creation. So a huge part of the project is working with the volunteers, and like I said, they've been doing all sorts. So they've been doing lots of surveys and getting data so that we can move forward and know what we're looking at. So on their winter bird surveys, they've been seeing all sorts on site, from kestrel to peregrine falcon, nuthatch, crossbills, green woodpecker, lots of great things, field fares and redwings. So yeah, and then now the season is about to kick off, so they'll be starting on bird surveys, butterfly, bee, botany, all of that really. So yeah, they're doing a great job at helping us to start gathering that data and monitoring the change, which is really vital, obviously. And then obviously practical tasks like this, when they were out, you can actually see the lug behind. This is where we were doing the sabre or no fence tree planting that I mentioned. So yeah, they are brilliant. And if anyone would like to get involved in the project, you can pop me an email. So might not seem too linked to nature's recovery, but a big part of the project and it's sort of changing land management and thinking about how we think about that, is actually in Wales. It's probably only about 0.08% of farmland is currently horticulture. It's really, really low. And we have got some market garden tenants in, and they are in the process of still setting up, but going to launch a market garden. So market gardens can be a really great way to use a small area, but to create quite productive, high amount of food from that small area in a very nature-friendly way as well. So they'll be looking at planting orchards, they'll have raised beds, polytunnels, and a small kind of eco-camping area as well. But yeah, it would be really great to see that kind of come to life. And we're just trying to demonstrate really at Pentuin different kind of farming methods and bringing in more diversity, as opposed to sort of just traditional sheep farming. We're trying to show that it can be a mix. We don't think there's a silver bullet of what we're doing at Pentuin, but we hope that the farmers we work with can take parts of that and apply it at their own farms and help them adapt to climate change and think about much more healthier soils and how nature can be a part of all farms. So yeah, we'll see that come together with the market garden. And then there's also produce from the meat boxes as well, so from the cattle. So we're working with our grazier to help him launch meat boxes. So 100% grass fed, without chemicals or fertilizers. And so it's really lovely to sort of help promote local sustainable meat production, and sort of less meat but better quality is kind of what we're promoting to consumers if people are meat eaters. So yeah, that was the event that we used to launch it as well in Prestine. So that was great. And yeah, maybe doesn't seem too linked to nature's recovery, but a big part of how we actually continue this project is building the vision and sharing that with people, sharing what we're doing. And so we're using different formats, like creating an animation. So the pigs were the star of the show this day, getting recorded for some of the sound on the animation. But yeah, starting to share our vision with people and what we're doing, so we can reach a wider audience and hopefully influence and inspire others. So yeah, this is quite nice because last time I've done these presentations, we were quite at the start of the project, obviously in September, and I could talk about the vision, but now I can actually tell you, we've done some great habitat work over the winter. And then there's some other upcoming ones as well. So this is our kind of 5-year vision card. So hopefully gives you an idea of how we would like to start seeing the landscape shaping up. So becoming scruffier and, like I said, more dynamic, lots more scrub and infield trees, wet areas. So as Dan and everyone has alluded to today, we've got, all those kind of natural flood management techniques are going to be really vital as well. So we will be doing work on certain fields to put in scrapes and ponds, try to hold back more water. Dan will actually be overlapping his project with mine and be putting in some leaky dam interventions on the north of Pentoon to also help with that. So that's really exciting. And then you can see this is our kind of 15-year vision card. You can read about our visions in more detail on our website. It kind of breaks down what we'd like to achieve in the 5, 15, and then this is 30-year vision. So yeah, really, we'd like to create a kind of wild and welcoming place that people can come and visit, and really feel like they've been immersed in a real nature-rich kind of buzzing landscape, because a lot of people don't really know what that's like anymore. I think we've got this sort of shifting baseline of kind of what really rich nature, kind of natural landscapes should look like. So yeah, that's Wild Pentoon, the project, and as I mentioned, we'll be working quite a lot with hopefully the wider people as well, local community, farmers, and the commoners on Beacon Hill. So it's really exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. That's great, and an exciting project you've worked, to bring that project on a huge amount over what has been a challenging winter. And as we come into spring and summer, we've got events organised. So if anybody does fancy visiting site, please do get involved and get in touch, especially if you're just over the border in Herefordshire and haven't had the chance yet. I think a couple of things just to say. Those pigs have no idea how famous they are and how much love there is for them. It's probably been one of the most sort of successful bits of engagement we've done in recent times. And I think it's just worth finishing with a quote from Alistair Driver to say that rewilding is a marathon with a sprint start. And a big part of what Chloe's been articulating is that we've come to realise that nature reserves are hugely valuable and that there is always a place for them in the future, but we need to think about how extensive grazing and nature-led management ties in with the farming systems, especially in Wales, where the land is considered to be more economically marginal and offers more challenging conditions for economically viable farms. We need to show that we can create a regenerative system that benefits local communities and creates jobs while still producing food. And we feel like we've really made great strides in that. And I think probably, again, might be a bit cheesy for some, but thinking about a quote that I've read today, because the National Landscapes Group of DEFRA have been meeting in England, talk about Dartmoor and progress that might need to be made there. And I've seen a quote kicking around from Rosa Parks, which says, "To bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first step. We will fail when we fail to try." So I think hopefully everybody can see that we are really trying very hard to take those steps to drive change. That's enough from me though. So thank you again to our speakers, and thank you to everybody for staying on. We have run over by quite a bit. I'm going to put that down to everyone's enthusiasm and commitment to their jobs and their work. So let's, if people have still got the energy, let's just throw the floor open for questions. So people can either raise their Zoom hand or quickly pop something in the Zoom chat. Again, a lot of thanks and well done to everybody. Any questions? Any last takers? I think we've answered most stuff as we've went along. So it looks like we can probably thank everybody one last time and the speakers and all that attended and close the talk for tonight. So I'm going to stop recording and hope everybody has a enjoyable evening.